David Marshall. I research what I call persona studies, which is looking at the mediatization of public personalities and their movement through our contemporary culture. My research interests have emerged from kind of two trajectories. One was related to public personalities, is a generic term, but a lot of people call them celebrities. And the other kind of research area has been what has been called for about 15-20 years new media. It probably doesn't make sense to call it that. And what's happened in my writing and research is that I kind of allow those two areas to intersect. So I'm looking at the transformation of public personalities through our changed media world. And our changed media world is very much an online world. And in that online world, we're invoked to present ourselves. And that invoking of our presenting ourselves is very, very similar to the way celebrity culture has operated for the last century. And so what appears to be almost a different universe, meaning celebrities and entertainment, actually informs a lot of what we do in our online worlds. What it offers people studying new media and working out how it fits in everyday lives is that celebrity studies is often a study of reputation, a study of attention, a study of influence, and in many ways online forms, social media forms, push people to make themselves visible in the same way as celebrities are visible. And so that research tradition of studying how people become well known, and admittedly they have agents and publicists that make them well known, and definitely cultural forms that make them well known, may be a way to interpret what happens when people put up a YouTube video, or what happens when they put up some explanation of themselves in Facebook, and it goes a little bit viral or becomes a meme. Those sorts of things are very similar to what has occurred in entertainment culture and, to a degree, political culture for the last century. And seeing the intersections of this weird world of online culture, which is trying to attract attention, and looking at it through the lens of celebrity, allows all of us to see what are the implications of becoming public. Recently written a piece that's called Exposure, specifically. It's a chapter in a book. And what interests me about exposure is that it kind of defines the contemporary condition. Exposure definitionally covers all sorts of things. Exposure, being Canadian, I'm very aware of exposure being exposure to the elements. But the actual word embodies this idea that we are revealing more and more of ourselves. And I guess that's what interests me, that we're getting more and more comfortable with a public version of ourselves at a level that would be unheard of 20 or 30 years ago. I think what's happening in this world of exposure is that we are becoming more sophisticated individually about what these levels of exposition do to ourselves. So some of us are becoming more sophisticated at our privacy settings when we're on social media. Some of us are becoming more sophisticated at making sure that we don't have our privacy settings on, because we like to see things go in interesting and unpredictable ways. Each of these defines a different kind of public personality. It doesn't mean that we understand it completely, but it does mean that online culture has pushed us to make new boundaries and lines of what is public and what is private. and new definitions, in a sense, of what is public and private. And we probably even need a new vocabulary to describe variations of public and private. So one of the things that really interests me is how much people allow the intimate to become part of their public exposure. And so I didn't coin the term, but it's a useful way of thinking about things, is that a lot of our image production online is a kind of public intimacy. We allow versions of ourselves that might have never been produced suddenly be everywhere, or possibly everywhere. I think that exposure specifically helps us understand that we have multiplied the number of images of ourselves and others exponentially. And that alone is something that has changed. And if it's changed, then it's interesting to me. What I did in the chapter is I basically went through every definition of exposure and said, oh, this elucidates another aspect of contemporary culture. So another version of exposure is the technological one. It's photography. It's the idea of, you know, the chemical producing the negative to positive or positive to negative formation. So you expose the film and it produces the image. So whether it's the daguerreotype from the 19th century to the digital one now, exposure is a technological transformation of the self. So we allow ourselves to be transformed into an image. And in that transformation of the image, we are getting closer and closer to a kind of new sophistication. I think it's a kind of new literacy around what that might mean. Just purely in the massive numbers of ways in which we allow ourselves to be exposed. It can be voyeuristic, it can be pornographic, but it can also be strategically valuable, that you're looking at your identity as an economic entity, and your exposure is just like an entertainment entity, a personality, a celebrity. Your exposure is very valuable to what you might do in the rest of your life. It may not be. You may do the wrong kind of exposure. It may destroy the rest of your life. But that's what we're dealing with in the contemporary moment.
A lot of people talk about the age of the selfie, and I remember you talking about the selfie moment. I mean, it's very hard to hypothesize, you know, what will happen in the future, but is that the kind of thing that could become naturalized to the point where we don't call it the selfie anymore?
Yeah, there's an interesting book. It's called Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and in that book he describes this changed world. It's a world. It's not an easy read. It's thousands of pages, so don't know whether you want to read this sort of thing. But in it, he describes how people become very comfortable with the telephone actually producing an image of themselves whenever they talk to anyone else, right? It's sort of like what is happening to me right now. So, but eventually he said what happened after about 5 or 6 years of this is people put on masks so that they would reconstruct themselves in some other way when other people saw them. And it became a kind of normal convention to actually put a mask on. I'd say the selfie moment is a moment where we begin to realize that the self that we imagine is only a kind of persona, is kind of a mask. It's not that it's negative. We can't think of it as a negative mask. It's just a way to strategically move through that aspect of contemporary life. So the selfie is not that big for me. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not Snapchatting. I'm not doing any of those things. But it is really big for 12 to 18-year-olds, and moderately big for other people, depending on how they use them. And for that demographic, if you can describe it that way, they have to negotiate a new level of the selfie moment. They have to say, what am I doing? How am I doing it? And they're getting, again, a kind of literacy that allows them to say, you know, I'm constructing this image for my high school friends. I'm limiting that image, and I'm making sure that that image does not migrate to my family. and they are working these things out right now. And that is the production of personas, which is at the very core of what I'm studying and doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the dominant discourse is that young people don't know what they're doing, but in fact they could be coming, in some ways, a lot of people could be becoming more self-reflexive about it and understanding that the idea of performance, which is huge in...
Exactly. I think we sometimes get into moral panics a little quickly, and we believe that some of these things are incomprehensible. But my observation so far, and this is anecdotal in some instances, but thought through in terms of how other people have written about it and looked at other things. But if I'm watching my son, who's 16, incredible sophistication at controlling their notion of what they reveal, a level that I would never even have thought of when I was growing up. And so as much as we think about how we move through a streetscape, and we are imagining our clothing and our hair and our movement of our body as a reflection of ourselves, we are now getting very sophisticated at a mediatized version of the production of the self. And those who are on the vanguard of that are probably the people who are using Instagram hundreds of times a day. The speed at which new media forms come into regular or normal use is incredible in and of itself, but it becomes normalized very, very quickly. So it becomes normal to imagine that you would have a mobile phone right beside you. Where's my mobile phone? I don't know where it is right now, so I'm a little agitated. But to make it strange is to realize that these things are constructions. They're fabrications of the way we negotiate our way through everyday life. And so if you can distance yourself from it and abstract yourself from the idea of its meaning, you will understand where it fits into the politics, the culture of our everyday lives. If you can't, you don't get that insight that you probably need in this particular subject and unit.
Yeah. Well, it's like with Second Life, it's very easy to study that in one sense because no one's been on it. No one knows what it is. I show Google Images, it seems weird, but with Facebook, much harder. So that's
much harder.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, the thing that I would have had to make strange was my natural relationship to television as I was growing up. So, and there are moments where we all make it strange. There's a what's called a slow food, slow media world out there, and do some research around that about how people say, all right, what if I change just for a couple of days the way I use media? Maybe the elimination of one thing allows you to realize how strange it is that you would always have that technology there. How significant it is that you see 16 images of your friends every day if you don't have those sorts of things. So giving yourself an abstract distance gets you a sense of how important it is to you, how significant it is to you, but also how possibly ephemeral it might be as well. That you can negotiate life, you still will eat, breathe, and survive with technology or without. Well, the interesting thing about academics is that what we found so far is that they work on a reputation and visibility culture very similar to celebrities. Not entirely, it's not exactly the same, but what we're finding is that higher and higher percentages of academics are producing versions of themselves online. And they do that partly because they have to. It's part of their job now that they're part of your worlds, students' worlds in an online way. But another part is that they're finding it incredibly useful to connect very specifically to a group of maybe 15 or 20 other scholars, maybe a couple of hundred other scholars worldwide. And it has become much easier as they become familiar with the different forms of social media and what has been described as their affordances or their possibilities. that has allowed academics to produce identities that migrate from their university into a wider intellectual and professional culture. So before they get to an academic conference, which would have been the starting point in the past for making one's research visible, they've already made those connections and established research networks that are quite powerful. Those who are more powerful at constructing a professional persona, an academic persona, are actually probably moving up in that profession much more rapidly than anyone else. That's what we've discovered so far. One of the things that's very clear when you construct an online presence is that it moves into the past in terms of how your reputation is established. Having said that, the thing that you have to realize is that different stages of career demand possibly different kinds of relationships. It may be very important for you to establish really strong social media connections to people that are doing things that are similar to you. So classmates, it's probably more important to make connections to classmates at this stage than maybe your high school friends. Even though they might be really important and they might end up at your weddings and other big events, the reality is that in the contemporary media environment, a lot of new directions in it are determined by an age or generation cohort. And the more that you gain that sense of the value of other people around you, the better you'll be positioned in a media career.